it is probably the best proving ground, the best place to actually practice personal transformation. I don't want to say best. I think intimate relationship or child rearing, I haven't had the experience of child rearing yet. I think those are also incredible, spaces to come in contact with the hidden parts of ourselves. But what I love about entrepreneurship is reality doesn't give a about how you feel. It doesn't care. And if you're an entrepreneur, then if there's a vision that you have that you want to create, you've got to show up in a certain way. What I have found, and I think what most entrepreneurs will find, is that there is going to be a moment where the current version of yourself with the nervous system, emotional patterns, and structures of belief that you came into the process with, they will fail you in your attempt to make what you want real because they are not correctly suited, they're flawed in some way, or they need growth and development. And so if you want this expansion, you got to grow. And it's a forcing function for growth. And it can be, if you let it, I think it can be one of the most beautiful, transformative, growthful, spiritually opening processes that a person can take on. It's not for everyone, but I personally think it's just magic and I love it. One quick note before we dive in. Alan and I have an upcoming program, or by the time you listen to this, a freshly released program for e-commerce entrepreneurs where we cover these concepts that we're about to talk in this episode in incredible detail, plus literally everything you need to scale your e-commerce business to over $600,000 in profit per year and work less than 10 hours per week, those are the results that I achieved in my own business. If that sounds interesting to you, definitely sign up for our free training at ecommercefreedomsystem.com to learn more. There's no dashes, there's no dots. It's just ecommercefreedomsystem.com. Okay, on to the show. The way we choose to see the world creates the world we see. Barry Neil Kaufman. Welcome to the What We Learn project, where we share our most important life lessons so you don't have to go through them yourself, and our struggles to overcome our challenges in a crazy world. We'll be taking you with us on our journey of growth, expansion, sometimes failure, and sometimes success, all with the intention that you learn with us and grow along the way. 3 things determine your reality in business, love, and life. They are your emotional patterns, your nervous system regulation, and your structures of belief. If you want a different life, whether it's success in business, deep love, a new level of fulfillment, or anything else, it only happens when these change. If you can learn to change them on demand, you can create anything you want in your life. And in today's episode, we're going to be talking about 2 absolutely fascinating, but also incredibly practical models for recognizing and transforming your emotions, nervous system, and beliefs so that you can create the business, relationship, life, or anything else you desire. I'm one of your hosts, Micah Cranman, and I've been an entrepreneur for the last 2.5 decades. In early 2023, I sold my business after nearly 20 years, and now my purpose is to learn and share what it means to live a conscious, joyful, awakened, and abundant life. You can find me on Instagram at Tatonka, Tatonkuh, if you'd like to learn more and follow me. And I'm here with my co-host, Dr. Alan Bittaker. Alan is by training a doctor of chiropractic and is currently practicing as a transformational coach with a background in a variety of modalities to support his clients. If what we talk about helps you uncover an area where you'd like to grow, he's available for one-on-one support or through one of his group containers. To learn more, visit him at Dr. Alan Bittaker on Instagram. Let's dive in. Okay, Alan, so let's talk about this incredibly cool model of reality that you shared with me earlier that has such a profound ability to influence our experience of life. So, in fact, we're going to be talking about 2 models. We're going to be talking about first, the hologram model of reality. Tell us what this is. Help us understand how it works.
Okay, brother. Good to see you.
You too, man.
I'm really excited to dive in on these topics. This model I'm about to be sharing today has been one of the most empowering things that I've learned in my life. With the amount of empowerment that it offers, it also offers some level of responsibility. So we're going to hold those with grace today as we. So the hologram essentially describes, and why it's so empowering, is that life is a reflection. All of our lives individually, all of our lives are a reflection of our internal state. So it's saying that we are the creators of our reality, right?
Got it.
and if I were to just like subtly shift that, I would say that we are the co-creators of our lives.
Okay. And why the subtle shift?
You know, there's like, we're in control and we're also not in control.
Right.
Like I can't control what other people do, and I can definitely control what I'm inviting in to my space. So yeah, just to describe more, the hologram, it was a model that I've learned in quantum physics, but positioned in this way by one of my coaches. His name's Ethan. He really described this model to me in a way that I got it. And it's something that's changed my life. And it's when we become aware of it, it puts us in the driver's seat to notice that everything that we're creating and how we're creating it's almost like a mirror. Like our life is a mirror that's shining back to us who we are. And I think we experience the most amount of pain when our life is not a reflection of who we feel that we are at the depth of our core, right? It's like off in some way.
Got it. So maybe I can just repeat this back to make sure that I'm understanding it and kind of take the listener's point of view. So if I'm hearing you correctly, essentially what you're saying is what we experience moment to moment, day to day from our life is the world itself telling us, whether we like it or not, that this is how you are on the inside, and external reality is a reflection of your set of, to summarize it like we did at the beginning, your set of beliefs, your emotional patterns, and your nervous system regulation. And to just add a little bit onto that, because I know a lot of people are going to be like, I'm guessing a lot of people are going to be like, for example, I was raised Jewish. It's a little difficult to come to believe that like the Holocaust was a reflection of people's internal reality, right? So I think there's, if I'm understanding you correctly, there's also an asterisk on this, which is we don't control how other people behave. So there's this domain of reality that is an expression of what we have influence over. And then there's also a domain of reality that we don't have influence over, at least at the level of being a regular human being. Maybe from a spiritual perspective, we might think, okay, my soul wanted to have this experience for its evolution, if that's part of your belief structure. Did I get that right?
Yeah, totally. And it's really interesting to bring in something like the Holocaust or something that's like so tragic, where at the human level, there's like, obviously no one deserved that or created that. And then from what I hear you saying is like on additional spiritual levels, there could be something else greater that's playing out.
Yeah.
But yeah, the gist of it is that we're creating a reality based on our state, and those three things are major, powerful components of what is in the driver's seat of creating our reality.
Okay, great. And just for the listeners that are like, I don't want to get woo, please don't go woo on us. I just want to say, this is actually going to be one of the most practical episodes that we've ever created. Not that we have a huge library so far, but I think it'll be extremely practical for you. So,
can I say something about the woo?
Yeah, absolutely.
I think that I tend to get the most triggered from woo spiritual language, especially from people who are speaking the language that don't even know what they're saying. So I totally get it. And I might say something, or I might come across as using some type of lingo that seems airy-fairy or bullshit. And I just want to I don't even know what else I want to say about it, but it's just like, I totally get it. And I wonder how you feel about this, Micah, that what seems the most frustrating to me is when people are using language in a way that they don't even know what it means. And they're just basically repeating words in the zeitgeist that have no inherent meaning.
Yeah, it's what I like to call spiritual word salad, and I fucking hate it so much, despite my deep dedication spiritually. But I think what I was sort of pointing at more than anything is that for the listeners that may be more interested in the direct, practical aspect of this, I think what I want to point at is this is basic logic, right? So the thoughts that we have, the emotions that we have, and the state of our nervous system profoundly influence our behavior, and our behavior profoundly influences the experience of life that we are having, period. It's basic logic. It requires no spiritual belief whatsoever to actually engage with this. And so that's for the listeners that have a more spiritual background that, believe in potentially reincarnation or, our souls came here for a purpose and all of that. Great. You can layer in some additional pieces that work for your personal cosmology. For those that don't have that, take this as a deeply, deeply practical episode to come in contact with something that may be hidden from your view that can actually be blocking you from the experience of life that you want to be having. And I think that brings us maybe to the next model. And because we're going to be talking about the hologram model of reality, but we're also going to be talking about the developmental model of reality. So what is the developmental model of reality? How is it similar? And how is it different from the hologram model of reality?
Yeah. Okay. So, and by the way, these terms are, I would say, loosely generated by us. There might be more specific terms that could be describing these models. The developmental model, in the way that I'm speaking about it, is a philosophy generated by Carl Jung, who's the father of modern psychology. In some ways integrated with internal family systems parts work. And the model is essentially saying that we have externalized experiences as we're going through our formative years. When we're growing up, we're having these external experiences that start to generate an internal psychology. It starts to generate our internal way of being. And then as we grow older and we create our lives in the world, we're subconsciously and or consciously creating our external reality based on our internal psychology. So we have externalized experiences, they become internalized, and then we then externalize them.
Got it. Like an analogy that comes to mind is water running over a rock in a certain way that shapes the rock, and then the rock now has a given shape in contact with reality. It's not a great example because we're much more dynamic than a rock, but there's a certain shaping process that influences, once again, our beliefs, our emotional patterns, and our nervous system. And those directly influence reality. And so this is more about the prior set of conditions that got us to where we are and the way in which it influences these three things that we really care about that we're going to be talking about today. Is that correct?
Yeah, totally. A really direct experience is my parents were poor and now I'm poor, right? Or like my dad had a terrible relationship with money and that's why I have a terrible relationship with money.
Yeah, and it could also be more hidden. It could be positive and it can be negative. Like one of the things that I discovered recently is when I looked at my family tree, nearly everyone, the vast majority of my family on both sides were entrepreneurs. My mom was an entrepreneur. My dad was an entrepreneur. My uncles were entrepreneurs. My grandfather, my great grandfather, like everybody was an entrepreneur. Everybody had their own business. And so there was this underlying hidden perspective that, yeah, you can totally be an entrepreneur. Because I looked at my parents and they were getting divorced and they were being shitheads at the time. And I was like, these fucking clowns, if these clowns can do it, I can for sure do it. So I started a business at 15. So like that shaped reality. That's how it works, right? So, and a lot of times this stuff, I think it might be fair to say until we start to look at ourselves in a deep way, this is mostly hidden. And I think it's important to name, tell me if you agree with this, even if you become aware of it, that doesn't mean that now it's different. Awareness is the first step in the process. Is that correct?
Totally. I totally, I think that we are self-adaptive, self-evolving. Mm-hmm. And if we're aware of something, we're also aware and connected with what we want most, that our systems are going to, over time, start to create opportunities and self-correct. And there's additional things that we can do to start shifting our internal psychology, our belief systems, our nervous system state, our emotional patterns. There's things that we can do to directly go in and shift these so that we can be a conscious creator of our lives.
Amazing. Okay. So I think that kind of is a good transition point. We've talked about these three things, the emotional patterns, the nervous system regulation, the structure of belief. We've talked about how they get created. We've talked about the influence they have. Talk to me about the way in which these influence or could influence each other and kind of, like it seems like there would be a feedback loop. Is that true?
Yeah, totally. Yeah. So, and it's one of those things where it's like the chicken or the egg. Mm-hmm. or both or all three, right? And so even when you ask me that, I'm like, gosh, where do I start here? Yeah, our bodies and our systems are so complex in such a beautiful way. And I'll just go in and start talking about an example of like, if we're dysregulated, then we might have some level of fear, or we might have a lack of access to higher brain functions that we can make higher level decisions with. And we might act out of a place of fear, and we might be trying to create from a place of survival. And when we're always acting out of that place, and then we start to create a life that is an expression of that based on the hologram model. And then when life is an expression of that, it reinforces what our belief system might be about ourselves and the world. And so it's kind of like this mirror feedback system that if you can't see it, if you can't see the system feeding back to itself, you're just an effect. You're an effect of the system. You're not really at choice. But when you can see it and you can see that it's a feedback loop, then you can actually start to use the feedback loop to be a director, right? When you're like, shit, I'm getting so triggered by this thing. Then we can start to inspect the trigger and look at what is the feedback loop showing you and where's the opportunity to shift. So yeah, how does that land for you, Micah?
Yeah, it lands beautifully. So just to recap, if I understand you correctly, let's just start at the nervous system. Let's say there's a pattern of chronic dysregulation. And for those that we're going to talk a little bit more about each of these in detail, but what nervous system dysregulation means is that you're not in a calm, relaxed, focused state. You're in a state of either anxiety, fear, anger, upset, anything that's not calm, steady, relaxed, open is a dysregulated state. So if you're in that dysregulated state, there's almost always a corresponding emotional pattern. That dysregulation and emotional pattern causes us to perhaps act out. That acting out or acting in misalignment with the intentions that we have for our life then causes something to happen in reality. That something happening in reality then reinforces what we believe about reality that may be counter to what we would be most empowering. And that belief then tells the nervous system, you should be afraid. So a way to maybe think about this is, I'm trying to think of an example of my own life. I'll give a kind of, pretty dark, actually, I'll give a pretty dark example, from my own experience. So years ago, when I was building my business, there was a period during which I didn't understand any of these concepts, but I was under a tremendous amount of strain and distress. My nervous system was dysregulated. I was both angry and I was anxious. And, that led to a pattern of both sex addiction and drug abuse that as a way to sort of navigate or calm the nervous system, which then reinforced some underlying shame that I'd had previously, when, as a consequence, my girlfriend left me. And then I entered into a relationship with someone who could not have been more perfectly designed to give me more feedback about why I was a shameful person, and because of her tendencies, and which deepened the nervous system dysregulation, which deepened the substance abuse, which deepened the sex addiction, until there was a breaking point and I was like, I can't do this anymore. And so that's a way that this cycle, that's a sort of extreme example of how this cycle can play out. But that's essentially what happened. So for people out there, well, welcome to my inner world of a very different version of myself some time ago. So I'll leave it there and as an example, and maybe we can talk about, we've already touched on why this is so essential. I just want to put a mention out there in particular for people who are entrepreneurs. I just described some of my experience. I didn't go into what was happening in my business, but it was pardon my French, it was a fucking mess what was happening in my business at that time because of this pattern that was unfolding. And so, if you are an entrepreneur, this is actually, I think, doubly important because in a more structured corporate environment, there's less load on your shoulders to make things go a certain way. But as an entrepreneur, you actually have to have an expanded capacity with your nervous system to be able to deal with and navigate the underlying challenges. And you have to have a really strong clear supportive structure of belief. And if those pieces aren't in place, you're going to really struggle to be effective and be successful and get where you need to go. I just want to call that out. It's important for everyone, but doubly so for entrepreneurship or anyone that is, trying to do something that's high impact, high output.
Thanks for sharing that, Micah.
Yeah, absolutely.
I imagine that people who may be listening might relate to some of the things that you shared, and listening to you share that just like reminds me of how how patterns reinforce each other. And it's what brings up an interesting question for me is the question of free will. And I've been dabbling with the idea of free will more lately and what it actually means to have free will. I don't think it's actually for me, I don't see it as we have the choice to change. I see it as we have the choice to change our nervous system. We have the choice to change our emotional patterns. We have the choice to change our, what's the other one that we're talking about? Our
structure of beliefs.
Our structure of beliefs. So it's like we have the choice to change the things underneath. And then that actually, like the free will is the expression of those things. And so I think the first step, as we've already said, is becoming aware. And yeah, it's fascinating and intriguing. And the entrepreneurial spirit inspires me. I am so inspired by entrepreneurs. I'm inspired by those of us that have a vision and we're wanting to create life that's beyond our current circumstance. That is like so fucking awesome.
It really is. And I also believe that it is probably the best proving ground, the best place to actually practice personal transformation. I don't want to say best. I think intimate relationship or child rearing. I haven't had the experience of child rearing yet. I think those are also incredible, spaces to come in contact with the hidden parts of ourselves. But what I love about entrepreneurship is reality doesn't give a fuck about how you feel. It doesn't care. And if you're an entrepreneur, then if there's a vision that you have that you want to create, you've got to show up in a certain way, no matter what the underlying is. What I have found, and I think what most entrepreneurs will find, is that there is going to be a moment where the current version of yourself with the nervous system, emotional patterns, and structures of belief that you came into the process with, they will fail you in your attempt to make what you want real because they are not correctly suited. They're flawed in some way, or they need growth and development. And so if you want this expansion, you got to grow. And it's a forcing function for growth. And it can be, if you let it, I think it can be one of the most beautiful, transformative, growthful, like spiritually opening processes that a person can take on. It's not for everyone, but I personally think it's just magic and I love it. I'm kind of, we're off on a tangent, but who cares?
Good. Yeah, no, I think it's right. Like I describe those as a class, like entrepreneurship is a classroom, relationship is a classroom for learning. I imagine having kids.
I think it's probably the ultimate classroom.
All three of those are like a confronting way to grow, but the most potent.
Yeah.
And it's right on track because it's like what I hear you saying is like our operating system. We need to upgrade our operating system in order to create from a new place to then create a new reality.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
There's this epic video on YouTube. I'll show it to you, Mike, or you can take a look after this podcast, but
maybe we can put it in the show notes too for people.
Yeah. I think it's called the backwards bike. It's like a 7-minute video, and it's this guy who creates a bike that, and when he turns the steering wheel to the left, instead of the wheel turning left, it's generated so that it turns to the right. So everything is totally backwards. And it takes this guy an extreme, it takes him, 3 months of practicing like 30 minutes a day to rewire his brain to something that is so automatic to then ride the bike backwards. And then after he learns how to do it and he does it for a period of time, he tries to get on a regular bike and
eat shit.
his shit's going crazy. And he can't do it until there's a certain period of time where his brain switches over to a new way. And
wow.
So if we were to just kind of peek into the next kind of area of the next step of the podcast, what I really like to help people with is to notice where they're creating from. And this is something that We get a little background noise.
Got a little feedback. My headphones just died, so hold that thought. Let me get the charger for them and see if I can change my settings so that I think I'm just going to have to mute myself. Give me 1 second. Sorry about that. Okay, Alan. So sorry about that. I'm going to mute myself. Please continue.
So I think the big shift for so many of us is recognizing how we're going about doing business. And this is something that I've seen and learned a lot from you, Micah, is I think maybe from your experience of doing business, you have a arrested, calm, methodical approach. And for me, when I started business, there was so much fear. It was like I was being run by fear. And what I came to realize is that when I created from fear, my business was an expression of that and created a circumstance that was like a container for me to experience more fear in. So even though I was like, okay, I'm experiencing this fear and this is going to get me out of this terrible state that I'm experiencing, it actually created like a cage for me to manage the fear that I had created. There has been a subtle and not so subtle process that I've gone through consciously over and over and over again to regulate my nervous system and to create life and business from a regulated state. And it's been so challenging and it's like so worth it at the same time. And yeah, it's super interesting. I'm curious your experience with that, Micah.
Yeah, thank you for sharing. I mean, I definitely have those. I've had some of those experiences, but I think one of the things that's made me such an effective entrepreneur is having started at a really young age. My first business was when I was 15, and I had the blessing of getting to play in the sandbox while being supported by my parents. You know, I knew that I was going to eat. If it didn't work out, like, what did I lose? You know, my motivation at that stage was like, I'm going to get, I don't want to go get paid $5.60, doing a cashier's job at Michael's, the craft store, like my friends were. I want more dollars per hour. And so I just started doing my own thing. And I think by the time I was actually on my own, which was 5 years, it was 5 years later. I quit school midway through my junior year. So I would have been not quite 21, junior year of college. I already had developed enough confidence in myself that the underlying belief was, I got this. I'm not worried about it. And the underlying nervous system state was, I'm calm. And it was like, it's interesting. I didn't even think about that until this conversation about the fact that it's made me super effective at entrepreneurship in many ways. But actually, we'll talk about this, I think, a little bit later, or we can talk about it now. The other effect that it had was that there were certain things that I had no fucking idea how to do, and I didn't even know that I didn't know them. So there were big gaps in my knowledge, and that self-assuredness actually got in the way of me learning certain things and having enough humility in certain ways to actually seek support that would have been so, so valuable. So these things can cut both ways. We're never going to be in a perfectly organized state, but it's all about the process. So maybe what we can do now, I think that would be really supportive, is to sort of talk about and we're going to contextualize this in maybe the frame of entrepreneurship. But I think what we can do is, people listening, just map this onto whatever other endeavor you care about. If it's, relationship or child rearing, we're going to use entrepreneurship as broadly as the frame so that it gets a little bit more real world and direct. So maybe you could talk a little bit about what are the common issues and hidden landmines that people run into in terms of the emotional or behavioral patterns, the nervous system dysregulation, and the structures of belief.
Okay. Underlying patterns. There are a lot of underlying patterns that I track with people. And I think the most common that I want to speak to, the first one I would describe as, I'll name, out of the 7 that I most commonly track, the top 3 would be like a self-reliant pattern of, I can't trust other people and I've got to do it all myself. The second one would be hyper control. I need to like control every little thing. And what else do I want to say about that? There can be some level of like frustration or anger expressed in the I would describe it as the aggressive pattern. And then the third one would be like a rigid perfectionist pattern. And the rigid perfectionist pattern has got some level of also control, but it can almost backfire and it creates, what's the word I'm looking for? Not taking action because the circumstance has to be perfect. So there's a lack of action taking because it needs to be perfect. I would say that those are the most common three. And I think probably the one that I tend to attract and help the most people with is the self-reliant. And because the self-reliant has to do with relationship and trust. And as we're in business, we're highly relational, right? There's no possibility of us doing business and making money with just ourselves, right? We have to engage with other people. And the self-reliant pattern is stuck in a model where there's not enough. And so there's kind of like this trying to get enough and an overgiving and running yourself dry because you're not willing to seek outside support and be resourceful in that way.
Got it. That's all super, super helpful. And just to name, I want to name a couple of things. So we're going to talk about what are the patterns, what are the typical issues, and then we're going to talk about remedies after, so that there's something practical that you're going to be left with to be able to work with. And I should also say, is it true that when we talk about these things, they're not clearly delineated in this is just an emotional pattern, this is just nervous system dysregulation, this is just a structure of belief? They can often kind of sit in multiple categories, but predominantly rest in one. Is that true?
Totally. I would describe it as a like construct, right? So we are a system of systems, right? And the heart system, the cardiovascular system doesn't exist without the pulmonary system. If we're just looking at like mindset and belief systems and we're ignoring the other ones, then nothing's actually going to shift. We want to see how they're all resting and playing a part in the total construct and how they're supporting and co-creating each other.
Okay, beautiful. So does it feel like you have sort of covered what the emotional patterns are, or, the tendencies, and we can move into nervous system dysregulation?
Yeah. And I think as I talk about as I talk about nervous system regulation, there's going to be a continued layered of each of these. I think the best way to understand nervous system regulation, there's more complex theories about how the nervous system works. I think probably the most complete one that I know about is the polyvagal theory. But said very simply, and the one that I learned in chiropractic school is I'm not sure what it's even called, but it's describing the autonomic nervous system, the fact that we have more of a sympathetic drive or something that is more fear-based. It would be described as fight or flight. And then we have more of a parasympathetic drive, which would be described as rest, digest, right? So one is more activated and one is more relaxed. There is, in polyvagal, they describe the more activated one as like fear. And it might feel like for somebody that they're stepping on the gas pedal and the brake pedal at the same time. So there's kind of an anxious quality to it. And then the parasympathetic is more of like this relaxed, easeful state. But in that state, you're not super alert, right? You're not really in a place of like, quote unquote, doing business. And so the third option that they talk about, and I think in polyvagal theory, poly means many. Vagal is referring to the vagus nerve, and it's describing what is our autonomic autonomic flavor or way of being. And autonomic is automatic, right? So it's like, how is our system automatically responding and engaging to our reality, and what is the tone of our nervous system? And so the third option that I want to just bring as an option for people to maybe imagine themselves embodying it is the option of I'm relaxed, I'm rested, I'm easeful, but I'm also alert, right? And you can imagine if you're playing a sport and you're playing a sport you love and you feel comfortable with, there isn't really the tone of like anxiousness or fear or the vision that pops into my mind is like when I'm taking a test. I took a lot of tests in chiropractic school. I would have this certain type of smell, right? And like that smell, that's like fear. I can smell the fear coming out of my pores. And so that's a different type of stimulation that I would have if I was like working out or throwing the frisbee or doing a sport that I love and I feel like calm and easy with the sport.
That's super helpful. And I think for the purpose of entrepreneurship, really anything that requires meaningful effort is sort of that both and state, that relaxed and alert state that enables us to move with intention and focus, but without overloading the nervous system and overwhelming ourselves. And I think in my own experience, the most important skill that a person can have is, I don't want to say most important, but I think it's so foundational to have this really stable nervous system and to have the skillfulness to bring yourself back into a stabilized nervous system state when you notice that you're dysregulated. Because in my own experience, as I pointed out earlier, there are follow-on effects of a dysregulated state. And the thoughts that I'm having are different. What I believe is different. My emotional and behavioral patterns are different. And so sort of you can kind of interfere at any level here to get a different result. But for me, the starting point is actually nervous system regulation, because the other two actually have this kind of magical tendency to resolve themselves on their own when I get into a regulated state. And I think anybody look at their own experience and map this out. You watch a horror movie and that puts you in a fear state, in fight or flight. For many people, some sick bastards find it hilarious, but that's not me. That shit freaks me out. And, I can't sleep. I'm feeling afraid. I look at a shadow and I think there's something there, and there's obviously nothing there. It just generates this whole, and my behaviors are now different. And if I can get myself into a regulated state, maybe that's by meditation, or maybe that's by, hanging out with somebody that I love and trust that didn't have that experience and is calm and relaxed themselves. It's transformative to the other two pieces. So I'd love to point at, and at least for myself, that this is the most important piece. And I'm curious, Alan, does that track with your experience working with your clients?
Yeah, absolutely. And I have a really interesting kind of baseline or perspective of these patterns, and the work that I was trained in is a modality called network spinal. And in that modality, we're trained to look at someone on the table as they're lying face down and to have awareness of these very subtle, nuanced things. And we're tracking how we do these like checks. We're doing these little checks, and we're essentially, to really simplify it, we're looking at the posture, and we're looking at these muscle checks and how the posture and how their body is holding, how it intersects with their psychology. And it's like one of the patterns is like when someone is like tucking their lower neck, they have this subtle posture of a tucking of their lower neck. It generates a psychology of mistrust in others. And then it has this like lens on reality, just like you're saying, Mike, of like, their nervous system has a specific tone to it that is now seeing others as untrusting, right? Because of their posture and how they're holding themselves. And yeah, and I think the nervous system is definitely the central nexus of impact. And if we can get the nervous system to a regulated state and then to start to notice itself in dysregulation, and then learning the strategies and the skills to de-escalate and go back into regulation when it gets activated, I think that is the most impactful way. I think that's the most important thing to focus on.
Okay, beautiful. I think maybe what we can do is come back to that, and we'll talk about practices in a little bit, but maybe we can just talk a little bit more about structures of belief and what that looks like and the impacts that can have. And then we can dive into how does somebody get regulated. But I think actually maybe even before we do that, for the people that don't have prior education in terms of, we've talked a little bit about the nervous system states, but we haven't talked in precision about the specific states and how they feel. Because I think what would be really valuable for somebody that this is new information for is to be able to recognize what does a dysregulated state feel like in the body and how do they identify what it is. And then from there, we can maybe make recommendations for specific remedies for those different states. Does that seem like a good thing to do?
Totally. Yeah. And there's so many different levels to speak to. The first thing that I can speak to is the biological response to these nervous system states. So a more sympathetic nervous system response, which would be more of a fight or flight state, I would describe as dysregulation. And what the body is experiencing generally is some type of fear. And what happens to the body in this fear state is that the brain actually starts to push blood to the back of the brain, the hindbrain, which activates more of a survival system, and our pupils dilate, right? So that we can see more of like our immediate environment. So the frontal lobe of the brain is no longer as active because we're no longer in creativity. We're no longer in as much executive functioning. Body starts to, like our blood vessels shrink in our guts, right? And we start to pump more blood to our extremities so that we can be in a state that actually embodies fighting or flighting. And so we're no longer in a place of like digesting our food, resting. So these are some of the things that happen on more of a biological level. And it's a really good question that you're asking, because I think most people are dysregulated at some level. And I would say that and I don't know your experience, Micah, but I would consider myself a very regulated person. And I'm also dysregulated sometimes, more often than what I would like.
Yeah. I think that's true. And I think maybe this is worth pointing at. We live in a world where there are many, many people who would like to sell us something to help us manage our dysregulation. And part of the thing that has to happen for a regulated nervous system to arise is to actually develop the skillfulness within ourselves to reach for appropriate resources in the environment, typically other people, to support us in getting into a regulated state. Other people who are safe and capable of doing so, I should note, because not everyone can do this for you. But I think more importantly, uncovering what are the practices that we need in our own lives to be able to consistently maintain a regulated state. And for me, for many, many years, one of the negative habits that I had to generate a regulated state was the use of pornography, and that led to sex addiction. And the reason is that when you get aroused and ejaculate, you go through a cycle in your nervous system. Arousal is actually a parasympathetic state. You go into a strong sympathetic state at the time of orgasm, and then you go into an even deeper parasympathetic state as a man. So it was a way I was actually intuitively trying to regulate my nervous system. And it had all sorts of second and third order effects that were very negative. So, at least for me, so it wasn't a good strategy. And so we'll talk more about these strategies in the remedy section towards the end, which I think is going to be the most important section. But I think also maybe we can just name, there are several key states. We might have already touched on them, but you've got fight or flight, which is I need to attack the source of my distress or something adjacent to the source of my distress. Some vulnerable being, as it often happens. You might get pissed off from one person and want to attack someone else who doesn't deserve it. I've never done that, of course, but I hear other people have. And then you've got flight, which is just, let me get the fuck out of here. I need to get the fuck out of here. This is really uncomfortable. And then there's freeze or shutdown. And for me, actually, freeze is the hardest one, because there's activation. There's like the fear, the discomfort, all of the stuff that's happening in fight or flight, but a kind of frozen quality where I just can't seem to get myself to do what I know I need to do to move out of the state. And so maybe we can talk a little bit about structures of belief and then go into what are the remedies for these pieces. Does that sound like a good plan?
Yeah, totally. If I were to add an additional state, and we can start with this one, it would be fawn, which would be more of a people pleaser response. And I think that this set of belief system is one of the ones that I was speaking about earlier, which is around the self-reliant, because the self-reliant belief system may have beliefs of, I can't trust other people. And in its kind of relationship to people pleasing, it's like, I'm the one that does things for other people. And that's how I get love, is like, I show up as the good guy, or I show up for people. And it can be massively uncomfortable to let people show up for me, because maybe someone's been rejected or hurt or abandoned or whatever circumstance created somebody to believe that they can't trust others. And in order to get love or energy, they need to do things for other people. And that can generate a continuous circumstance of being under-resourced and drained. And yeah, I think the overarching belief system in that pattern has to do with enoughness, right? Like there isn't enough for me, or there isn't enough for other people, and I have to take responsibility for other people. Yeah, is there anything else that you recognize in that belief system, Micah, that you see?
No, I don't think so. I mean, it's a really common pattern that's run. I think maybe we dive into just this last category, like beliefs, and maybe I could share a little bit about how this can be a lever for change to occur. Just a little anecdote for people to be inspired, and then we can talk about what it looks like, how it can be. So as I was navigating a period in my business where I think the wheels were falling off the bus, I had a friend who exposed me to a personal development organization called Landmark. There are some culty aspects to Landmark, which I don't love, but the teachings that they offer are really extraordinary, and they all work in this area of beliefs. And what I found was I had a bunch of beliefs about who I was, but my actions and behaviors were inconsistent with them. And so I was carrying around false beliefs that weren't true. And I also they weren't true from the perspective of how I had been behaving. And the process of being in or working with a framework in a community that was willing to say, hey, look at yourself. Is what you think about yourself actually true? Allowed me to start a long process of transformation. That was what got me out of the pattern of sex addiction, of porn addiction, of shame and self-judgment, of a pattern of anger and being domineering in my business. There's like a lot of different elements that unraveled that were part of the way I was being in the world, that were a consequence of inconsistencies. And so I think the power of working at this level is sometimes it can be it's less direct, but sometimes that's what at least for me, that's what I need. Okay. So we've covered a lot of ground so far, and now we're going to transition into talking about these tools, and we're going to start talking, like we said, we're going to dive into belief as the next major item, and we're going to talk about how we can use the structures of belief as a lever for change. So, Alan, can you talk to us? Let's just kind of use a real world example. Let's say we've got an entrepreneur who's wanting to start a new venture, maybe someone who's never been an entrepreneur before, and they don't have any evidence to believe what they need to believe in order to be successful, which might be something like, I can do this, despite the fact that 96% of businesses statistically fail, right? So there's a lot of real world information that might be counter to the belief that they need in order to be effective. So can you talk to us about how this might work for somebody? What are the pieces or the ingredients of change here?
I think this is a really good entryway, and what I notice, what I do with myself, and what is kind of like what happens between, say, someone like you and I, Micah, is tracking the language that we use. I feel like our language describes the beliefs that we hold. And so if we're using language that in some way is limiting us, and we're creating our reality as like, as if it's solid. And so an example, I think in this domain, and based on the last example we were talking about as well, of like the self-reliant, is I can't trust people to to responsibly do the work that I've been doing, right? So I can't delegate, and I can't grow, and I can't scale because I can't trust others to do a good enough job. And when someone uses that language, there's oftentimes it's backed up by past experiences, and that belief is reinforced with behaviors of, maybe if I don't trust that you're going to do a good job, I'm not building the skill set and how to delegate and offer good leadership and having you do the job that I want you to do. Right. So it's basically, I think the belief system is a powerful entryway into like recognizing my language. And then from there, I think that there's support, like there's guidance. What I personally do is I get support from other people who've got a different belief system. I hang out with other people who've got a different belief system than mine. And I recognize that my belief system is faulty in that way. Like I've had a false imprint, and I start hanging out with people, for instance, who make a lot of money and they have a good belief system around their relationship with money.
Really cool. Yeah. I mean, it's sort of obvious when you think about it. And I think this is the thing that's really counterintuitive about beliefs, at least in my own experience, is that it's very reasonable for a person to form a belief based on their perception of what happened as being true. And the problem is that it's not like good validated data. You know, we live in a world with like 8 billion people. And, you know, just because we've had an experience so far that indicates that's not how the world is, doesn't mean that there isn't far better evidence out there. I mean, the most obvious thing is if you look at a horizon at an ocean, the tendency is to think, okay, the earth is flat. But that is a bad belief, right? Even though it's based on your experience. Sorry, flat earthers, go fuck yourself. You're dumb. And I am intending to offend you.
Like how you labeled it, it's a bad belief.
It's a dumb, wrong belief. And we all carry dumb, wrong beliefs about ourselves and the world. And so there are, you know, empowering beliefs and there are destructive beliefs, and they have real world consequences. And I love this notion of spending time with other people who have different structures of belief, and sort of taking those on and getting a new direct experience of like, oh, actually reality is different than I thought. Fantastic. Talk to me a little bit about how, like, what's the you know, in the process of doing something new and important, like creating something that we've never done before, learning a new skill. Talk to us about the importance of integrity, or really self-trust and integrity in that process. How is that interrelated?
Yeah. Wow. So I was actually just working with a client today, and there was like this space that I was noticing that would get really crunchy when I would ask her about what she wanted in certain areas of her life. And I could feel kind of like this, I would just describe it as crunchiness of like her not wanting to hang out in the space of not knowing what she wanted. So she would divert, or we'd bounce out of that very quickly. And so I think we all need space to be in the space of not knowing. And it's like fertile ground, and it can be highly uncomfortable. And then it starts to prime our mind to gain clarity around what it is that we do want. And I'm bringing that up because I think integrity is the amount at which we are taking action towards what we want most.
Mm-hmm.
And I think my buddy Christopher Life he has some of these definitions of words that I love, and they're like kind of like guiding forces in belief structures. And so he uses sovereignty in a way of aligned action, taking aligned action towards what I want most. Is my capacity to be sovereign, is my capacity to take aligned action towards what I want most. And in order to do that, I need to know what it is that I want most. And then integrity is to the degree at which I'm doing that. And self-belief and self-trust, what I have been in the experiment with myself with as much as possible, because I'm someone that's generally taking, a lot of change in my life. I'm like trying to grow as much as possible, and I have my own negative cycles. And one, I'll just like admit, I went to nutrition school, and I grew up wrestling. So I've had an interesting relationship with food. And so making change in my relationship to food, there's kind of like the setting goals, and there's like the complete rigid approach. And then there can be like the opposite of rigid and just me doing whatever the hell I want most in this moment, but not what I want most overall. And then there's kind of this space in between. And the space in between is where I see is where we gain connection with ourselves and self-trust. Because if I'm like, I'm never going to have a cookie again, and then tomorrow I have a cookie, after I eat that cookie, I'm not going to trust myself very well. Right. But if I'm like, I'm only going to eat a cookie after I work out, or whatever the goal is, I'm only going to eat 5 cookies a week versus 7. And then I'm making goals that are stretching me just enough for me to be successful, and then to then start to gain trust in myself. So I don't know if that, there's kind of a lot of weird examples in there, but
yeah, I mean, I think you touched on it, that doing what you've committed yourself to do, or not doing what you've not committed yourself to do, is kind of what I would define as integrity, both with self and with the world. And maybe I can just share in my own experience, when I'm trying to create change, or I'm trying to believe that something is possible that I don't yet have evidence for, if my integrity is out and I'm not doing what I've said that I'm committed to most of the time for the most important things in my life, then there tends to be a disbelief that this new way of being, or this new belief that I'm developing, is feasible and realistic. And because it's like, I know that if there's a belief that, let's just imagine that it was important to me to be a billionaire. It's not. But if it were, and I had a belief of, I have everything that it takes to become a billionaire, and yet I'm like eating like absolute garbage, and I'm committed to not, there's going to be this feeling of like, am I really going to follow through? Is that really true? Am I the kind of person that does what's necessary? And it's insidious. It's this, it's like, in the same way that when we have a relationship with another person and they don't follow through on what they say they're going to do with us, then we lose trust in them. And anything that they say that they're committed to, we're going to be like, yeah, maybe. We'll see. Probably not, but we'll see. And the same relationship happens with ourselves. And so I think the foundation, the sort of underpinning of being able to develop new structures of belief that are supportive to things that are outside of our current level of skill or comfort zone, is integrity. It's like, just, you got to have it. And not integrity in terms of morality, but like, literally, are you doing what you're committed to most of the time for most of the things that are important for you and for what you've given your word to with other people? And for me, that was one of the most life-changing things. I mean, I've touched on sex addiction earlier in the podcast, and one of the ways that it manifested was a propensity to watch pornography, even though I didn't want to be watching pornography, and I was committed to not watching pornography. And that degraded my self-trust in such a profound way. I couldn't even begin to understand how it had, until I really finally stopped. And then I was like, oh shit, this has an impact literally everywhere in my whole life. So I think we've beat this horse to death. I think we've touched on belief.
I want to say 2 more things. And I think it's really important in the realm of self-trust and these like small but big things. And I think there are, you're reminding it, like, there's things that we want to do. Well, first of all, there's agreements, right? And we're always in agreements. And so it sounds like you were in agreement with yourself to not do something, but that you were doing anyways. So I think most of us are, to some degree, we all have some level of self-sabotaging behaviors. And so there's things that we're like wanting to let go of. And then there are things that we're wanting to step into doing. And I am, my personal way is to just be in conscious awareness of me doing the things or not doing the things for as long as I need to, prior to letting myself naturally make the shift or make the change, and
Mm-hmm.
not beating myself up about it, but just like really watching myself in the behavior of doing or not doing, and being with how it makes me feel. And then when I'm ready, I'm like, maybe it takes me feeling like shit for a long period of time until I'm like, all right, that's enough. Now I'm ready to make the change. And introducing new behaviors, I use the example a lot. I love the method of the one push up a day. And I live this. I did this for 2 years where I had an agreement with myself to do one push up a day. And, I could be lying in bed at 10 p.m. and I could be like, fuck, I didn't do my push up today. And I would roll over in bed and do the push up and fall asleep. And most days I would actually do probably about 100 push ups because I'm like, all right, I'm down here doing one. I might as well do 20. Okay, I already did a set of 20. I might as well do another set of 20. So yeah, that it has like the compounding effect. And then it's like me doing good things for myself. And then it also in the same way, but opposite of the porn addiction, it infiltrates into all of life.
Totally. Thank you for sharing that. I think that's a really beautiful piece. Maybe we could transition actually into talking about the tools for nervous system regulation. We obviously structures of belief is a huge topic, but maybe that'll give people enough inspiration to start with. And so maybe we can talk about nervous system regulation, because in my experience, nervous system dysregulation is actually the primary culprit for why we don't have integrity with what we say that we're going to do. So let's talk about what some tools are for nervous system regulation that people can begin to use to keep themselves in that calm and alert state and bring themselves out of a dysregulated state.
Okay, so the challenge that I want to just name off the bat is that in our culture, there's especially in the United States, there's this kind of cultural reflection that most people are in some level of a nervous system dysregulation, and they're in some type of belief system that they need to override themselves in order to be worthy enough or a functioning member of society, right? It's what everyone does. It's kind of this grind culture. And so it's an interesting thing to wrap our minds around when everyone else is doing the thing that we're doing. So I just want to name that it might, we need like a new input, a new experience for us to then see the difference in what it feels like to actually have a regulated nervous system. And so I'll name it. Yeah.
Can you just back up really quick when you say override themselves? I just want to double tap on that. What do you mean by that?
When someone is like, working a 9 to 5 job that they hate, and they're like miserable, exhausted, burned out. It's a toxic environment. There's terrible relationships. People are talking bad about each other. They're swimming in that water, and maybe they're not even aware of how disruptive it is to their internal state. And then they lie to themselves about why they're doing it. And it's because everyone else is doing that, and it's what you do. It's what you need to do. And I've, Mike, I know you're a lifelong entrepreneur, so it's like probably crazy sauce to you. And to me, I've been a lifelong student. It took me 28 years to get through school. So it's sometimes, I'm just saying this because I feel insensitive when I say this to some people because I haven't had their experience. And so, but I have had an experience of starting my own business and being in total dysregulation, right? And panic attack style. So, but I knew that was unnormal, and that it was highly uncomfortable. And, it just took me a period of time of getting through it. What I'm wanting to name is that there's kind of this cultural group think that it's okay to be dysregulated. It's the way to go. And my belief is that that's causing major stress to the system, and that's the major cause of disease. And if your way of being and your job and all of that shit is killing you, then you're not truly making a living. This is quite the opposite. Micah, I don't know if you can hear me. I can't hear you though. There we go.
Got it.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
I accidentally, I muted the mic previously to cough. Okay. So what I was going to say is, I think what I'm understanding is that essentially what you're saying is the first step to having a regulated nervous system is to actually recognize and come in contact with what is dysregulating you, even if it's quote unquote normal. And there might be all kinds of things that are doing that, like your job, the cultural context, watching the news. It might be some of your personal relationships. And so the first step is like actually just realizing, like, when your body tells you by feeling like garbage, hey, don't do this, to the extent that it's possible, stop doing that. Is that right?
Totally. And I want to name just 2 or 3 more things. Is I think a lot of people, it seems like, aren't actually in contact with what it feels like to experience their own feeling like shit, right? Like they're like so constricted in their body and so up in their minds as a defense strategy to not feel how bad it feels, that it's like hard for them to notice how dysregulated. It's hard for them to notice how dysregulated. I'm gonna try it again.
I love that you said this word 1,000 times. You got this.
It's hard for them to notice how dysregulated they are because they're disassociated from their bodies, which is where we feel the dysregulation.
Right. And I think the second piece is that there are so many coping strategies in modern culture, in modern society, that we are constantly being pitched and which are made extraordinarily convenient in order to allow us to interrupt the body sensations of discomfort, whether that's a cocktail, a Netflix series, porn, social media, food, and all of this stuff I think none of it's bad if there's a healthy relationship to it, but it's so easy to kind of put the 1 hour Band-Aid on it, 8 hours a day, or 15 hours a day, that we lose sight of what's actually happening. And so I think there is also a process of coming in contact with this dysregulation. And it requires courage. And I think maybe it's worth saying that noting and being with and moving through a dysregulated nervous system state is actually quite normal and quite healthy. It's just an underpracticed skill in our culture. And so maybe what we can talk about actually is, what are some tools, specific tools, that, let's just say top level basic recommendation is stop numbing yourself, notice how you feel, whether it's anxious or angry or whatever that is, and then work with it. And in the next section, we're going to talk about processing the emotions that are a corollary of dysregulation and give you some specific tools. But maybe what we can do is talk about some tools that are really helpful for developing a much more regulated baseline state. That's so that you start with more capacity, more relaxation, more ease, more clarity. So what would be, let's say 3 tools that you would recommend for people as a consistent, whether daily or multiple times a week type of practice?
Okay, awesome. So yeah, what I hear you asking is like, how do we regulate our nervous system? And then from having some level of a regulated nervous system, how do we then go into some level of, next we're going to cover tools around processing emotion. But what I hear, the brilliance of your question is like, it's essential for us to have access to some level of regulation, whether it's through somebody else or if it's through ourselves, to then go into processing emotion, because we don't want to kind of crawl into a dark hole without a rope and any way to get back out. So the couple of ways that I see as the most effective for nervous system regulation.
And maybe we can just divide these into two categories. One being baseline, like this is a practice that you do all the time in the same way that you would go to the gym all the time to create a healthy nervous system that in general is in a more regulated state. So that's like bucket one. And then bucket two could be tools to get you out of a dysregulated state when something triggers you.
Yeah, totally. So the first tool is meditation. And meditation is something that I avoided as a daily practice for such a long time because I became very proficient at other ways of regulating my nervous system. And the more that I've dove into a regular practice for meditation, the more that I've seen the major benefits of it. And so just like gaining trust in yourself in any other way for a daily practice, I recommend for my clients a very minimal starting dose of meditation, like 5 to 10 minutes a day. And then if someone can really get a glimpse at what it's doing for them, then it's easier for them to then take more action at doing it more often. But I think 5 minutes a day would be just like learning some level of habituation of learning to just sit down and not do anything for 5 minutes. It's kind of just flexing the muscle. And it might not give a whole lot of benefit. It probably still does to some degree.
I think it does. I mean, I think even a few minutes can be just extraordinary. I mean, I'm a believer in meditation. It's my shit.
Well, I think you probably have such a deep resource for that part of yourself, right? There's like, you can probably go into meditation and you've got direct access to like this calm, peaceful state that you've cultivated within yourself. And so just just consciously tapping in for 5 minutes, even 1 minute has got even more of a benefit, right?
For sure.
I feel that way for me as well.
For sure.
And I recommend and I do this myself, is I like doing guided meditations most of the time. And oftentimes I do it just for myself. And a really simple way, if you're looking for something that's external, or if you're doing self-guided, is just like literally tracking your breath and noticing the sensation of the breath, and then finding stillness. And so it's just like body, breath, and stillness. That's it for 5 minutes, or 10 minutes. And then notice how you feel beforehand and notice how you feel afterwards.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's one of the most extraordinary practices I think any person can do, particularly with consistency. It tends to stack. Maybe what we can do is include a guided meditation, or, an additional resource in the show notes for people, because I do think it's such a simple thing. And once you have a relationship with it, it's like, it feels a bit like not taking a shower, not doing the meditation. There's that quality of like, this is that important for my well-being. And there's a very, very, very deep well that you can go into. Okay. So we'll put that in the show notes if you're a listener, where I think I'll just name it. Probably a great place to start would be, I love Sam Harris's app called Waking Up. It's non-denominational. There's nothing, layered on. He's got really, really clear pointing out instructions that work extremely well. And his style is very direct. So it can open your experience into, it can reveal dimensions of your conscious experience that you may not have ever encountered very quickly. And that can be profoundly nourishing for the nervous system. Maybe we can talk about another one that's in sort of, and that's bucket one, although it's really bucket one and bucket two. All of these are. But something that's maybe more specific to bucket two is box breathing. What is box breathing, and how can people use this to regulate their nervous system?
Yeah, I'll pair box breathing with another type of breath where it's okay. So box breathing is very simple. It's how you would maybe imagine a box where there are four sides, Each side of the breath, or each side of the box, is a different aspect of the breath. So there's a count of inhale, there's a count of holding the breath in, there's a count of exhaling, and then a count of holding the breath out. And elongating the inhales, holds, exhales, and holds, the more that we elongate that, the more that it starts to activate the parasympathetic system, and it kind of cues the nervous system to relax. For me, I use it as generally more of like an easy wind down tool. If I'm not moving from a triggered state, but more of like a high energy state, I'll use it as like a wind down tool that just gently kind of winds my system down and has me access a deep, calm state. And my personal approach is to go as extreme as possible, which is taking as long as I can. Sometimes 15 to 20 second inhale, 15 to 20 second hold, 15, 20 second exhale, 15, 20 second hold. So
that's quite long for listeners that haven't played with this. That's really intense. What would be, I mean, I think a good starting frequency would be like 4 seconds in, 4 seconds hold, 4 seconds out, 4 seconds hold. Is that
totally
pretty typical?
That's typical. And then if you want to start extending it, the more essential aspects of the breath to extend the hold or the breathing period would be the exhale and that. So the more that you're exhaling, or the extending the exhale, is going to activate the parasympathetic nervous system more.
Yeah. I think I've heard that the way that this works is that the breath is intimately linked to the nervous system state. So when we get triggered or activated, breathing rate goes up, and when we relax, breathing rate goes down. But you can also control or influence the nervous system by controlling controlling the breath, and so it kind of goes both directions. Is that accurate? And yeah. And
I mean, that's what makes sense to me.
Okay, and then my understanding is that the way that the nervous system generates a calm state is, or learns, okay, we're in a safe state, is, which leads to a parasympathetic response, is the ratio of not breathing or breathing out to the ratio of breathing in. So the more length of hold or out breath there is relative to in breath increases the parasympathetic response. Is that right?
That sounds right.
Okay. I think that's what I've heard. That's what I've heard. Okay, cool. And so how long would somebody do this for?
5-10 minutes, really, like as long as they want to. And if someone wants to really just like get into a Zen space, they could also link it with like theta brainwave states or something like that. They could also...
Would that be an audio recording?
Yeah.
Okay, got it.
Yeah, you can easily go onto YouTube and just look for theta brainwave states binaural beats.
Okay.
And then additional way, and this isn't something that I normally do every day or anything like that, but it's nice to, if I had a hard time sleeping, and I know a lot of people have a hard time sleeping, right? I would definitely include a practice like this before bed. I would even maybe lie and I would put my feet up the wall or raise my hips above my heart. When the heart gets lower than the hips, it also brings down the nervous system, because it's like having to work less hard to, actually, I'm not sure the science around it, but I imagine it has to do something with blood pressure, heart rate, and breath, and how all of those co-regulate together.
Got it. Okay, cool. And just a note, don't do this while driving. Bad idea. Not safe.
No.
Okay. So, talk to us about, movement and how that interrelates with nervous system regulation.
Well, the term, I've heard it described to me in this way, which makes a lot of sense. The term fight or flight, right? And I like looking at the body in this way of like, how do we work with the natural waves, the natural way that the body works, like the expansive contraction. Like there's kind of this, how do we meet ourselves? How do we meet life? How do we meet things where they're at and get with it where it's at? And then maybe even take it further in the direction it's going to then allow it to move in the opposite direction. So for instance,
yeah. I was just gonna ask, how does that look practically? Can you bring that into the real world for us?
Yeah. I was going to mention another breath style. And so I've used this breath style in a way that is really supportive in this exact kind of philosophy and way of thinking. And the breath style is like this. You would describe it as the breath of fire, or similar to the breath of fire. So like an intense inhale and exhale through the nose. And it's a hyper stimulating breath. So if I'm anxious, my system's already revved up. And then if I get with it and I use a breath that meets my body in its level of stimulation, then I can gently then ride it back down to more of a regulated state. So
is the idea essentially that we're acknowledging where the nervous system is at, which is activated, let's say, in an anxious state. And so we're actually sort of an anxious state, which you might also call, like you were pointing at, fight or flight, a sort of a low-grade version of fight or flight. The idea is that by actually engaging in some vigorous activity or breathing, which might actually happen in an anxious state already, we're kind of giving the nervous system the opportunity to go through the natural process it wants to move through, kind of at the animal level. And once it does that, then there's going to be a tendency to soften and relax and go more into a regulated state. Is that right?
Totally. Yeah, that's it.
Yeah. There are some videos on the internet that are absolutely wild. The first time I saw them, it blew my mind. There's one in particular of a gazelle getting caught by a lion, and it goes into a freeze response, and it's being held by this lion. The lion's holding it by the neck, and it's so frozen that the lion thinks it's dead. The lion puts it down and kind of gets distracted, and the gazelle gets up and bolts away. And when it gets away and gets to safety, it goes through this really wild process of like shaking and like moving all of this energy, which was like, the theory is it's the movement that wanted to happen when it was in the mouth of the lion, but couldn't because it was in a freeze response. So it's like discharging all of this anxious energy from the nervous system, and then goes back to just being a normal gazelle. And so it's this idea of discharge from the nervous system. So it sounds like that's what we're kind of playing with.
Totally.
And I presume there are other ways of doing this, like physically moving through space, shaking, dancing, crying, whatever it is. Yeah.
All of it. Yeah.
Okay. I think this is maybe a good transition point to start to talk about processing emotion, because that's really kind of what we're edging into. And these two are pretty interrelated, and something that I think is really important to point out is the relationship between emotion and being able to feel and process emotion fully, and our what's called nervous system capacity. So what that means is, if you have a healthy, vital, sort of well exercised, for lack of a better description, nervous system, your ability to feel and release like that gazelle is going to be robust. For most of us, it actually, there are sort of upper boundaries of what we can feel or process on our own in terms of very big emotional states, whether they be grief or rage or what have you. And so if we didn't learn the capacity to do this on our own, or in really intense situations, maybe almost no one could, because we're social animals and we're supposed to be actually in a tribe, we need support to release and process that emotion. So maybe you could talk about how, maybe can you kind of just explain for people what they might do when they encounter an emotion that, or experience that feels too big, where they just feel flooded and totally overwhelmed. what should a person be doing to support their emotional state?
Yeah. So, great question. I want to mention just the obvious, that there's self-to-self practice, or there's ways that we can hold by ourselves, and then there's ways that we can get some outside support. The outside support I would describe as co-regulation. It could be just the nervous system, it could be a nervous system co-regulation at the nervous system level, and it can also be at the emotional level. And if you're wanting to get outside support, obviously you want to ask someone that you trust and that is also regulated. And then I would also recommend asking very specifically, right? So it's like asking someone if they've got space on their schedule. Are they available? And are they like externally, are they circumstantially available? And then are they available within themselves? Right. So it's like, are you free and are you available to support me with something? Asking in that specific way kind of, I think, depressurizes the fear of rejection, especially for someone that has a hard time asking for support when they need something. And so I think that's really subtle, but also important. And then asking people that you really trust. And I would imagine doing it in a way where you're not only just like talking about it, but you're more than talking, you're like feeling and being, and someone, you have the felt sense of someone feeling and being with you. And there's something in the nervous system that's called mirror neurons, where our nervous system is trained to reflect and mirror each other. And if someone is in your space is regulated, it's actually going to start activating your nervous system to be more regulated. So I think a lot of times, like, just talking about the thing is a way to not feel it. So, big invitation to really feel, and to, even if the other person's open to just being in a space with you, like sitting, and it works on Zoom as well, but sitting and just being with somebody and noticing yourself and noticing them does really beautiful things to the nervous system. It's a really powerful way to co-regulate, and it is it's something that's in our nature. It's a mammalian thing that all mammals do for regulating their nervous system.
Very cool. I'll just say too, if you've never done this before, it can feel super fucking weird. The first time a person engages in this way, it's sort of like noticing, oh wow, I have this big emotional charge. I can't seem to be with it all by myself. I really need help. I ask a friend, and then I don't say anything. They basically are just there with me while I might wail or cry or whatever the hell is going on. There's a digestion process. So in the same way that we digest food, we digest emotion, and it can be really, really strange. But I have found that as little story as possible is actually the most powerful way for me to engage with this. And it's interesting too, because in my own experience, I've found that the more that I do this, the more that I've done this with other people, the more that I'm actually able to do it for and with myself. Both being on the offering or receiving end of this, it's like the nervous system gets trained that it's safe to feel my feelings and I won't die and I can do it. and then I do it. And then I'm like, oh, I feel better, and for so many years, there were strong emotional experiences that would just cripple me for so long. And I felt so uncomfortable asking for support. And it was like, I had, it was like a nervous system couldn't lift a weight bigger than 20 pounds. And like getting to be on the other side and supporting other people and being supported, it's like my nervous system got to like 80 pounds, mm-hmm. And I can lift this heavier weight all by myself now. It's a really beautiful thing. It sounds super weird, before you come in contact with it, but it can be really, really, really healing. And it just rewires you.
Yeah. The other thing I want to share that works in the same way, like what I hear you saying is like the I mean, there's such like a process. I think the hardest part about emotion is identifying with the emotion, and like, and then yeah, it makes it really fucking hard. And so there's like a skill set and a training, and I would say part of the skill set, the map that I use is called AAA. It's awareness, acknowledgement, and acceptance. And doing it on your own is a good resource to have. And then, like what you mentioned, is like the more you do it with other people, the easier you can do it on your own as well. And so awareness is like, I'm aware that there's an emotion bound up in my body, and maybe my throat's tight, or maybe my heart feels like it's collapsing, and I can feel that. So I'm willing to be aware, or I have the capacity to be aware of it. And then I'm going to acknowledge it by allowing it to be there and allowing myself to feel it. And then I'm going to back up before I go into the last one. The first piece is in getting some piece of resource. The language is kind of weird, so I'm going to find a different language for it. But
well, maybe you can just describe what do you mean by finding a resource?
Well, in the first example is getting outside support. So the other person would be the resource, right? The other person is the regulated nervous system that is kind of holding, that's allowing more space for the person who's feeling to feel their feelings. And so what I do on my own or with clients is, in the beginning, I find a thought, I find a feeling, I find, when I place my awareness in my feet or my thighs, or, I have an access point to feeling good or feeling grounded or feeling safe. I want to get to that access point before I go into acknowledging and being with the hard, big emotion.
And why is that?
It's like, I want to actually resource the emotion. I actually want to bring energy. I want to like mesh it with something that has stability, right? If I'm just like going into the shit and rolling around in the shit, it's like there's no like getting clean, right? It's like, it's not helping it. It's just like
you don't want to wallow. You don't want to wallow like a pig. You want to execute a cleanup operation.
Yeah, it's not like I'm just scratching my scabs so that they bleed and they grow bigger. It's like, no, I want to like maybe trim off the ends of the scab and clean it so that it heals, and I'm like taking care of it and loving it. So I think that's something to look out for. I don't think that's in the general population, but I think people in more of the healing population have kind of this like continual addiction to processing. Interesting thing.
It's a fact. If anyone is coming from the outside world and doesn't know what we're talking about, we're sorry for the inside joke, but
yeah.
If you know, you know. Okay, so what this is bringing up for me is this notion of like parts of ourselves that are resourced and parts of ourselves that aren't resourced. And I think if you want to kind of learn more about this idea, Richard Schwartz has this concept of parts work, which is a really beautiful model of personality, consciousness, like how the whole kind of inner world works. It's actually a little bit like, what was that Pixar movie where they had all of the feelings? Each one was like a personality. It's so cute. People will be able to figure out what we're talking about.
Yeah, I haven't seen it. I know exactly what you're talking about.
Yeah, Inside Out, I think is what it's called.
Yeah.
So like finding resource, if you want to kind of dig deeper, Richard Schwartz's work is really, really beautiful. Does that feel like a complete loop? I mean, we've talked about getting outside support. We've talked about, it was awareness,
acknowledgement, and acceptance.
Got it.
So I'm going to complete that. Essentially, the acknowledgement piece is the feeling, like me feeling my feelings and bringing resource to my feelings, and create like, it's in contrast to the phrase someone might say, what you resist persists. So I feel that with anxiety quite often is like, if I'm not willing to just be with it, it's just going to persist. It's just going to be in the background. It's going to feel terrible. So I'm going to create space to just be with it. And so, yeah, getting resource. And then at the end of that process, I recommend people like just notice, just like breathe. I sometimes use acknowledgement phrases of like, sometimes I feel anxious right here, or sometimes I feel scared right here. Right. And which is quite different than other schools of thought of like, I am safe, even when someone feels super unsafe. Right. So yeah, back into parts work. There's parts of us that are safe. There's parts of us that don't feel safe. And this process is an opportunity to just acknowledge and feel what feels real, even if it's not absolutely true.
Okay.
Yeah.
Great. So kind of going the other direction, we've talked a bit about processing emotion. Let's maybe talk a little bit about, maybe you're in a moment where you don't have the availability in terms of time, in terms of your inner resource, in terms of being able to be supported. You're having some strong emotion and you need to actually shift your state so that you can function and perform. This is quite relevant in a context where someone really needs to show up for what they're doing. Whether it's in a business or in a high demand role or anything like that. So talk to us about dose and what it is, how it works, and how it can be used as a tool to shift emotional states.
I would like, so the thing that you're bringing in around like needing circumstantially to compartmentalize your emotions and step into a state of power and show up for something. I would say that's like a different skill set. I think it's a super powerful skill set. The breath of fire, I think, is really good for that.
Okay.
And dose would support it, especially if you're dosing with states or experiences of like stepping into your power. But I see dose, and dose is DOSE, stands for dopamine, oxytocin, serotonin, and endorphins. And it's a way to start bringing in a different set of neurochemistry rather than our habituated emotions. So dose is something that's used oftentimes with chronic illness, or people who are sometimes sometimes are struggling with like something. I've seen it used for people who are manifesting their reality, or like in the manifestation world, or they're trying to get through something like Lyme's disease or mold toxicity. And so it's a way to kind of break the habitual pattern of emotion, and you use it as like a 5 to 10 minute visualization, and you feel into a past or future memory, and you're feeling into it, and sometimes even speaking it out loud as if it's happening right now in this moment, and allowing your system to actually get dosed in the experience of what it would be like to experience that in this now moment. And your whole experience shifts, right? Like you start to feel empowered, or whatever it is that you're having an experience about or a memory about. And then I'll just flow into the next one, a gratitude practice. It's very similar to a gratitude practice. It's bringing your attention to something that you're appreciative of, or, you're grateful for, and you want to experience more of it. You're like bringing your awareness to that, and it starts to kind of flood your system with those types of emotions.
Beautiful. Okay, that's super helpful. Thank you for clarifying that. And I just want to make a distinction for myself. So a dose practice would be distinct from me remembering a prior sexual encounter with a lover. Or could that be included in a dose practice? I mean, like anything is it? Okay. Yeah. So the spank bank is fair game. Okay. Very good.
Exactly. Like if you're like, oh, I want to have more of those experiences, or I want to experience that right now in this moment, using your memory bank or creating a future memory. And, especially if it's in integrity with what you want most, and then you're creating that neurochemistry, and you're actually like, then you'll start acting in maybe ways that will help you create that in real life.
Okay, great. So past and future spank bank allowed. Fantastic.
Yes.
I just couldn't resist. I'm a child. I'm still a child. Apparently I'm 13. Okay. So we've covered a lot of ground. We haven't covered everything. I think there are probably two things to say, but I think we're getting close to wrapping up here. So if this was supportive for you, if you felt like this was valuable, I would encourage everybody who's listening to this and wants to be supported directly, personally, one-on-one, to definitely reach out to Alan. He's an incredible coach and does this, I don't want to say all day, but a lot of his day, most days. So definitely reach out to him. You can find him at Dr. Alan Bittaker, 2 T's. It's DRALLEN BITTAKER on Instagram, and you can send him a DM if you would like to work with him. The other thing that's available to you is if you're more on the entrepreneurial side, Alan and I have a new program coming out for e-commerce entrepreneurs specifically, and we're going to be teaching this content in greater detail and in more depth as part of our program. It's going to be launching probably sometime in mid-February. So we're going to also cover like everything you need to know to really, really crush it as an e-commerce entrepreneur. It's the same system that I use to generate over $600,000 in profit per year and work less than 10 hours per week while I did it. So if that sounds interesting to you, which I hope it does, you can head to ecommercefreedomsystem.com and sign up for a free training where we kind of go over the broad concepts and then invite you into the program if that's something that's interesting for you. We're not sure when this is going to be released, so it may already be out, but it's coming likely mid-February 2025. And I think, unless there's anything else that you think we need to cover, Alan, that should be it. Yeah?
I think that's good. I think we've covered a lot.
Okay. Yeah. God bless. And we hope this helps. We hope it serves. And we look forward to seeing you on the next one. Thank you so much for listening. If you found this episode valuable, there are 2 easy ways to support the podcast. First, simply subscribe to this podcast or channel on whatever platform you're listening or watching on. And second, please share this episode with a loved one or a friend or someone who would be positively impacted by it. Thank you so much once again, and see you soon.